The war in Ukraine has irrevocably changed Russia. It's turned a nation that once had vast power and potential into a hollow shell of its former self, a lifeless husk, a corpse that those in charge are desperately trying and failing to reanimate. It's not the first time Russia has undergone such a dramatic collapse. It's the third. But this one might just be the most devastating of all. To understand why, we first have to take a step back in time. Over 100 years back in time, to be precise, to 1917, when the first great Russian collapse occurred. This was the year the Russian Revolution began, when the people of the Russian Empire, struggling with poverty, inequality, and the devastating effects of the First World War, grew tired and frustrated with their Tsarist overlords. Protests and strikes broke out, and the Tsar of the time, Nicholas II, was forced to abdicate, bringing several centuries of imperial rule to an end. From there, following a brief period under the provisional government, the country was rebuilt from the ground up by Vladimir Lenin and his socialist Bolsheviks. They envisioned a better and more prosperous Russia under a whole new system, the Soviet system. It relied on one central notion: the very concept of private property should no longer exist. Instead, it should be up to the state to plan and control the vast majority of economic activity. The population, meanwhile, was told to forget about personal desires, comforts and wealth, and to instead devote itself to the greater good, working side by side towards a brighter and happier future. The big benefit of this system was that it allowed the Soviet Union to mobilize vast amounts of resources very efficiently. This made it relatively easy to construct everything from massive factories to nuclear programs, and of course, one of the biggest and strongest armies on Earth as well. But as the world moved into a post-industrial age, the Soviet system stopped working so well. It lacked the flexibility that other societies increasingly relied on, the innovation that allowed other countries to advance in areas where the Soviets stagnated. The country was still able to pull off impressive feats of engineering. It sent a man into space before the United States and launched the world's first satellite too. But in the simpler areas, the areas that actually mattered most to everyday working men and women, it lagged miles behind. It was a system that was too reliant on treating people as a collective, as cogs in a machine, all moving in the same direction, without the freedom to think, adapt, and innovate for themselves. Meanwhile, despite selling itself as a classless society in which everyone was equal, the Soviet Union had a clear and obvious ruling class, powerful elites known as nomenklatura, who enjoyed the most luxurious lifestyles, as well as exclusive access to foreign goods, fancy vacation hotspots, and superior healthcare that was off limits to the general population. It was a broken system, and it was only a matter of time until it all fell apart. In 1991, that's exactly what happened. And so we come to the second collapse of Russia, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the formation of the modern Russian Federation. A post-Soviet capitalist state, the new Russia looked and felt more in line with the rest of the modern world, but retained a dark and ugly underbelly of criminality and corruption. The old elites didn't go away or give up power, they just got richer. And so the age of the oligarch began. Whether they were buying up private property, funneling money into offshore accounts, or taking up spots on the boards of the biggest companies, those at the pinnacle of Russian society amassed extraordinary wealth and power, and they didn't want to let go of it. So they stymied any sort of competition or genuine democracy. Just as it had been before, Russia was stuck with a broken system that rewarded the few and punished the many. But at least for a while, it worked because of one simple thing: oil. Russia's ever-growing and increasingly valuable oil industry propped up its economy. Money poured in from the country's sprawling web of international trade partners, and while those at the top siphoned off most of that money, enough spilled over to gradually improve the quality of life for those at the bottom. The public knew that the system was rotten and that those at the top were leeching off them, but they didn't necessarily mind as much as they otherwise would have because they at least got to experience some benefits. Benefits that had once been off limits during the Soviet days, like easy access to foreign goods and the prospect of being able to work their way up the ranks, eventually affording a nicer home, better food, fancier vacations, and so on. But the war with Ukraine has shattered that dynamic, exposing deep strains across the system and leading to what could become the third and most damaging Russian collapse of them all: the erosion of many of the fundamental systems that keep the country running and its people from rioting in the streets. And the responsibility for this collapse rests at the feet of one man, and one man only: Russian President Vladimir Putin. When he assumed control of the country over 20 years ago, Putin clearly decided he never wanted to give that power up, and has since twisted and reshaped the Russian political system to suit his ends. But whenever one person stays in power for so long, they have to justify that fact. They have to show the people that it makes sense to keep them in charge year after year, decade after decade. They can do that in several different ways. The obvious one is to simply do a good job of ruling the country and making it a better and more prosperous place in which to live. But that often becomes much more difficult over time. Another way is through military operations. If a leader can claim to be defending their country or reclaiming lost land, they can use that narrative to keep the people on side, which explains why so many dictators end up taking their countries to war in the end. It's the last resort, the only remaining way for a faded ruler to remain relevant. And when war begins, a new set of rules come into play. At that stage, it doesn't matter what happens to the economy or if people's lives get better or worse, because those in charge can argue that the country's very survival is at stake, and that's the most important cause of all. In reality, of course, it's more about a desperate ruler doing everything they can to keep their grip on power, which is exactly what Putin has been doing in Ukraine. He wanted to cement his legacy, to go down in history as the greatest ruler Russia had ever known, a modern-day Peter the Great. In doing so, he tore his country apart. Because the only reason Russia managed to function, despite its broken system in the pre-war era, was because of its economy. It had so much income coming in from all four corners of the globe, expanding the oligarchs' bank accounts, while incrementally improving the standard of living for those lower down the food chain. But Russia's wartime economy is a pale imitation of its former self. The Kremlin can try to defend it. It can point to factories that are still functioning, workers who are still employed, and regions that still report growth. But look past the propaganda at the economic reality of Russia today, and a much grimmer picture begins to emerge. A picture of an economy split in two, with the first part dedicated to the war, the second simply existing to fund the first, and both parts doomed to eventually fail. As the years have gone by, more of Russia's budget and economic activity have been dedicated solely towards the conflict. This includes the likes of factories producing drones, missiles, and artillery shells, for example, as well as all the companies and teams behind logistics, transport, fuel systems, machine parts, security, recruitment, and other elements of the Kremlin war machine. This is the part of the economy that Russia's officials actually care about. It's the one that gets all of the funding, attention, and support. It's also the one that the Kremlin points to when it wants to argue that Russia isn't failing, that its output is rising, and its economy is doing just fine, even in the face of increasing international isolation and damaging Western sanctions. The second part of the economy, however, is ignored, overlooked, and swept under the rug. This is the part that Putin and his cronies don't like to talk about, but it's the one that affects the more than 140 million people that call Russia home, because this is the part of the economy they rely on for food, for comfort, for healthcare, for education, and everything else that people need to live a decent life, and it's getting worse by the day. But before we go deeper into that, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every week. While Russia's military economy remains strong, due to increasingly vast shares of the federal budget being pumped in to support it, the civilian economy is floundering. The war is an all-devouring beast, eating up resources at record rates. People, fuel, and raw materials are all being used to satiate that beast's extravagant appetite, and the general public is feeling the effects. This is no longer a Russia where people can dream of a better future, but one in which they simply struggle to survive. A Russia with declining standards of health and education. A country where the main businesses that prosper are those that serve the war and everything else is left to rot. A place that no longer holds any incentive or offers any sort of reward for ambition, innovation, or creativity. When the war economy dominates, ambitious young people or those trying to feed their families aren't thinking of interesting ideas or unique business plans. They're increasingly being funneled into either joining the military directly or contributing to the conflict in other ways. Meanwhile, the quality of life continues to decline for the masses, while those at the top keep on hoarding wealth and power however they can. At the peak of the post-Soviet era, there were oligarchs, certainly, but other people could also work their way to better lives, make connections, build businesses, buy property, and so on. That can't happen anymore. The state can't allow it. With dwindling resources, it can only support the people and entities that provide the most value to the conflict: the defense contractors, the military suppliers, and the other people who build and finance the war machine. Everyone else becomes little more than disposable livestock, and at that point, those people's rights, protections, and freedoms no longer matter. So the state has no qualms in stomping all over them. That's why 2026 has seen increasingly strict crackdowns on the public's ability to access the internet. People aren't just struggling to put food on the table and having to pay more fuel and food, they're being cut off from the rest of the world, one app and website at a time. The likes of WhatsApp and YouTube have effectively been blocked, and the tools people once used to get around these restrictions, like VPNs, have also been heavily restricted. The average Russian can no longer comfortably reach out to friends or relatives around the world, access independent or foreign news networks, or watch content that hasn't been approved by the Kremlin. Even one of the country's main domestic payment systems suffered a massive collapse due to technical problems related to the VPN block. But the Kremlin doesn't care. Whatever slim amount of interest it may once have had in the well-being of the workers and the prosperity of the people is long gone. It's not fazed if its internet crackdowns harm small businesses and creators, or if its censorship campaigns make life harder for everyday people, if delivery services fail and hardworking members of society, like teachers, doctors, and carers, lose access to the tools they need to fulfill their roles. Because none of those people are priorities anymore. The war is the sole priority, the one and only driving force that actually matters to those in charge. If the Kremlin keeps its defense industry running, it believes that everything else will work out, because the success and survival of the most powerful people and businesses are all tied to that particular part of the economy. For a while, it seemed like Moscow might get away with this plan. But as the war continues to rage and draws closer and closer to home, this delicate house of cards is being pushed closer and closer to its breaking point. Because back in the early days, the people didn't necessarily feel the war's effects all that much. They knew a war was going on and everyone had his or her opinions about it. Some agreed with it, some disagreed, but the majority weren't really impacted. They were still able to go about their day-to-day lives, still do the same old things they'd always done, visit the same Moscow coffee shops, enjoy the same comforts, and follow their familiar routines. A battle was raging, but it was so far away that some could effectively convince themselves that it wasn't even really happening. In 2026, that way of thinking is no longer possible, because this war is no longer taking place hundreds of miles from Moscow in distant contested territories and frontline kill zones. It's seeping and spreading all across Russia, permeating the very fabric of day-to-day life. And this is happening in both direct and indirect ways. The direct ways are the most obvious and explosive: the drone and missile attacks on Russian infrastructure. With increasing regularity, Ukraine's forces are launching precision strikes on Russia's oil facilities, military bases, airfields, storage depots, and military-industrial sites. Kyiv's forces don't target civilians, but civilians are often in the area when these attacks happen. They see the drones fly overhead, they hear the impacts and explosions, they watch the fires rage and plumes of smoke fill the sky. And that changes everything. It makes everyday people feel as though they're in a war zone, and it gives the people running and working at these locations a whole host of new problems to deal with. Because if you run a business that is in any way linked to the war, you could be at risk of a drone attack. At any moment, your production plant could be put out of action, your operations could be destroyed, some of your staff might even be wounded or killed, and you have to somehow find a way to live with all of that. Then there are the indirect ways in which the war is making life worse for Russians, like the labor shortages caused by so many able-bodied people being dragged into the war and ending up dead or wounded, and so many more fleeing the country at the first chance they got. With fewer people working, so many domestic businesses failing, and fewer of the best and brightest contributing to society, society inevitably degrades. Transport gets slower, services get worse, and pressure builds up on those who are still able to find work. And the country's currency, too, has lost value. Meanwhile, many international companies have cut ties with Russia and no longer provide important goods and services, and the people are forced to make do with less. Less of everything, less cash, less comfort, less freedom. It's a recipe for disaster, and as that disaster draws nearer, the people in charge are becoming more panicked and desperate. Normal states operate in relatively predictable ways. They come up with plans and allocate funds and resources accordingly. It's not perfect, but it's reliable and it works to a certain extent. But wartime Russia is losing that reliability, that predictability, that routine that people need to feel as though there's actually some sort of order to their lives and surroundings. Instead, it's slipping into a state of emergency rule, a state in which stability and structure are replaced by improvisation and spontaneity. It's no way to run a country, especially not one as vast and complex as Russia, because all thought of logic, reason, and responsibility goes out of the window. Nobody knows what rules will apply from one week to the next. Nobody is prepared to make big decisions because they don't know how those decisions are going to be received. Regional officials are now having to spend more of their time and energy simply responding to the Kremlin's latest whims and desires, rather than trying in any way, shape or form to make their pockets of Russia better for the people who live there. They're too busy handling disruptions caused by the likes of the labor crisis, infrastructure strains, and internet shutdowns or incoming drone swarms to do anything truly beneficial or worthwhile. This cannot last. The people will not put up with it forever. So many have already had to bid farewell to loved ones, losing brothers, sons and fathers in futile frontline assaults. Others may still have their family units intact, but have seen everything about their lives get worse, from their career prospects to the quality of the roads they drive along each day and the price they pay for tanks of gas. The people can see that they've been abandoned. They're frustrated, restless and angry, and even in Russia, where any hint of dissent is classed as a crime, they're making their voices heard. Putin's poll numbers are dropping. People are sick and tired of the rich overlords treating them like dirt. The last time this happened, about a century ago, it resulted in the end of the empire and a complete rewrite of Russian society. And if Putin continues to treat the population so carelessly, his regime could face a similar fate. Now, learn more about the dark and dangerous path Putin is treading in this video, which explores how his ruthless quest to conquer Ukraine at all costs has effectively forced his country back in time. Or check out this video for a look at how Ukraine continues to defy the odds and achieve the seemingly unachievable, using the smartest tactics and most surprising innovations to outmatch and outplay Russia in every metric that matters. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos just like this.